All right, welcome everybody to another Q&A episode. Thanks for joining me, and let's get right into it with a question from Noah Evans. He asks, I have a few short questions. 1, Dostoyevski episode when? I don't have a definitive answer for you there. I mean, maybe this could be an opportunity to kind of pose the question back to everyone in the comments. But when or what would you like me to cover by Dostoyevsky? I mean, Crime and Punishment would seem to be a natural choice, but on the other hand, from what I understand, I don't think Nietzsche actually read it, so it might be more appropriate to cover like The Idiot or something that we know that Nietzsche for sure read, but I don't know exactly. I also really like Notes from Underground, so that might be a very natural thing for me to cover just for the sake of talking about it. I talked a little bit about Nietzsche's take on Dostoyevsky in the episodes on Nietzsche as a psychologist in Twilight of Idols. That was toward the end of season 4, I guess, I think is when we were talking about that. But so, the honest answer is I don't know. I could tell you, maybe next season, maybe, right? It would have to be, I think there would be a real interest in it. So maybe I'll cover something by Dostoyevsky that I'm a fan of. 2, thoughts on Bob Dylan. Well, as regards what? I mean, I like his music. I like a lot of, especially like his very first album is really cool. I like a lot of his early stuff. I like Electric Dylan. I do think some of his later work is a little bit silly. The lyricism isn't as good. The main thing about Dylan is lyrics, right? And, not even the vocals themselves, but literally the lyrics. That's the main appeal for Bob Dylan as a folk musician. It's just that the songcraft and the meaning behind what he's saying, the poetry set to music. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Bob Dylan. I like his work. He's never been like he's never been like in my top 10, for me at least. He's, I have to be in a certain mood to throw on some Bob Dylan. As far as folk goes, I'm more into like, who do I like? I mean, I like some of Leonard Cohen's stuff. I like Neil Young. Obviously, my band covered a Neil Young song. I mean, I've spoken recently about how I'm a huge fan of like a lot of Celtic folk standards, and I like Kim Robertson, who's a harpist who does a lot of that kind of folk. It's very different from the kind of 60s folk of Bob Dylan. Buffy St. Marie is pretty cool. It's kind of a obscure little record that I very much enjoy. But yeah, Bob Dylan was never like one of my main ones. But I grew up listening to Bob Dylan, just like, along with everything else from that era. Okay, 3, have you heard of King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard? And if so, thoughts on them? Yeah, I have. I mean, funny story, I remember I actually, in Destroyer of Light, when we were recording a demo at the studio in Westlake Hills, which is just outside of Austin, they were like, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, we're just here. And it was during when they were like releasing, I think, like an album almost every day for a month or something like that. They put out like an insane volume of like whole albums. And so what I really enjoy about them is the experimentation and the fact that they're kind of all over the place while still being like very enjoyable to listen to. There's some very experimental stuff like Captain Beefheart that I can only like listen to too much of, but King Gizzard is pretty cool. I've never seen him live. But yeah, again, not like a central band for me, but I am aware of them. I do like what they're doing. It's cool. What I've heard, I enjoy. Noah also says, your podcast has been really helpful for not just my understanding of Nietzsche, but also just for getting me interested in philosophers I otherwise may not have heard of or cared to dive into. So thank you for everything you do. Thank you as well, Noah, for supporting the show. All right. The next one is from, I don't know how to pronounce that, Irandms S. IRANDMS. Okay, they say, let's say Nietzsche was excluded from the set of possible topics / philosophers you could talk about. Who, if anyone, or what, if any school of thought, might you have considered basing a podcast around instead? It's a very interesting question. I mean, in some sense, all of the other philosophers that I talk about extraneous to Nietzsche or like related to Nietzsche kind of reveal what my interest is. But it seems like you're really asking if I had to focus on one thing, like one thinker, and it can't be Nietzsche, who would it be instead? And I'm trying to think of what I would want to spend it's a very difficult question because I don't know if there's another philosopher where I would want to spend the same amount of time as I've spent on Nietzsche just delving into their work, or where they're like related to enough other ideas that make it interesting, right? The sort of like branching out that you can do from Nietzsche is really interesting. I mean, my inclination is to say that I would probably do something either focusing on early Chinese philosophy, like maybe Taoists, or, and by Taoist, that can be a contentious term. What I mean here is Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, Lizi, not the religion of Taoism. And, just as a brief aside, the reason why Taoism is a misnomer is like basically every Chinese school of thought uses the term Tao. It can be compared to the term logos in that way, and we don't have like a logosist school of philosophers. It would sort of like be grouping all the pre-Socratics or, Heraclitus along with Plato into the logosist school or something like that. And then meanwhile, to complicate things, there's like a whole religion based around logos. Well, I guess there kind of is Christianity in a way, right? So that's why it's kind of a misnomer, but that's really who I'm talking about, is that particular strand of thought. Wu-wei thought, we might say, something like that. I could see myself focusing on. Obviously, at one time, it would have been Zen, which I have a couple of questions about here. Other than that, it might be actually the pre-Socratics, if that counts as one area of focus, like Greek philosophy. Like it might even be Socrates, i.e. a Platonic Dialogues podcast, because that is the most... You could also do a podcast on that, and there is enough material there to cover a lot of content, and then you could branch out from there into the whole of the rest of philosophy, because it's all a footnote to Plato, right? So, funnily enough, I might pick that, even though I agree with Nietzsche in being like anti-Platonic. If I were to do a Plato's Dialogues podcast, I certainly wouldn't present it from that perspective. I wouldn't be doing it to tear down Plato. But, that's the irony there. But the reason is because you could basically... It is true what Whitehead said, that you could start from Plato and basically find many of the major ideas that would develop over the course of Western philosophy. So even Plato might be a strong contender for that. It's very hard for me to find any sort of like modern thinker. And here I mean modern in terms of the historical epoch of modernity that begins with really the early modernity begins in the 1500s, with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. It's very hard for me to pick one thinker from modernity or beyond that I would really want to spend this amount of time talking about, other than Nietzsche. So that would be my answer. HSN asks, would like to hear more about your time in Zen, and what idea/concept of Nietzsche do you have the most contention with? I'm going to answer the second question first, because when I answer HSN's first question, I'm also going to read another question. I'm going to skip ahead in the order that I received these questions, because it's like a related question. I'll answer them both at the same time. So HSN's second question, what idea or concept of Nietzsche do you have the most contention with? I've brought this up in the past, but I would say Nietzsche's critique of causality is maybe my hardest, or like that's the thing I struggle with the most, because I feel like I have the most contention with that idea, because I realize how revolutionary it is, and I'm actually very amenable to the idea, but I don't fully believe it. And that's because even if causality is just a way of structuring the world a la Kant, if it is a synthetic judgment a priori and not necessarily true, that's all fine. But we're living in the phenomenal world that's patterned by causality. So my way of carrying Nietzsche forward, that also happens to disagree with Nietzsche on this front, is that we should actually probably continue to think causally. And I mean, the example I've used in the past when arguing about this with someone is that it's really relevant to me insofar as my own actions cause things that are relevant to me in the future. Like, I have to practice my guitar parts in order to like learn them and internalize them. And even if from like the superposition of all time and space, temporality is an illusion. I'm living within the temporality, and it seems like my practice causes it causes proficiency, and a lack of practice would cause a lack of proficiency. So I know we could like logically deconstruct all of that, but I guess for my purposes, if the goal is really to recenter ourselves in the immediacy of the phenomenological world, then this critique of causality I don't think is really serving anything. On the other hand, this is also central to Nietzsche's critique of free will, which I happen to agree with. And so it's like a contention for me in terms of I actually see the merit in the idea, because I see the merit in deconstructing the whole causality as regards the will. And I think that's an important critique, the critique of the will. And I know if listeners aren't familiar with, my lengthy discussions on these topics, it's almost just too much to go into here, and I've already gone into it at length. You can especially check out all the stuff I've talked about on the Gay Science read-throughs recently, like the last 5 or 6 episodes, deals with a lot of these same issues. So that's something that I struggle with, is the critique of causality. I think it's almost an idea that's like so pragmatic that it's hard for me to part with it, just for pragmatic reasons. And the other thing is that many people would classify that as maybe a Nietzschean position of going with what is pragmatic, what works, what serves life, in spite of whatever might be the objective truth. The fact of the matter is, it's actually not terribly clear to me that that is Nietzsche's position, because he does criticize life-preserving, quote-unquote, myths and sacrifice sacred cows and so on and so forth in a way that does deliver us to the naked truth. And as we all know, if you want to be a disciple of truth, then inquire, right? That the strength of a soul could be measured by how much truth it could tolerate. So he actually is trying to delve into these dangerous truths, including critiquing the whole causality of the will, which has dire ramifications for all of our theories of moral responsibility and what our whole legal system is based on, and so on and so forth. So I don't know, as you can tell, I haven't fully worked this out for myself. I feel like I understand the ideas, but it's very hard for me to understand what to do with the information, and that's like my biggest contention. Other than that, I mean, usually when people ask me this question, they're wondering about Nietzsche's opinions, like politically. Do I agree with Nietzsche? I mean, not really. I think he made some very important and powerful points in description when it comes to his prescriptions. I mean, even with his prescriptions, oftentimes it's not the way that people are portraying them when they're talking about Nietzsche's radicalism. But and even the things he says that are wrong are based on ideas that I think are very interesting and worth considering. There hasn't really been, I attempted to do it on this podcast, but outside of my own engagement, I haven't really seen people try to like comprehensively tangle with the totality of Nietzsche's politics and what it really implies and how to like move forward with that. And so I think a lot of these issues, it's very hard to give a simple for or against, but I mean, that's how I'm going to interpret your question. These are kind of the issues I contend with the most myself in my own thought. So then you asked me about my time in Zen, and I'm going to read another question by Azure Propagation and answer these two questions together. So Azure Propagation asks, I'm deeply entrenched in the Western meditation space currently, and I find it interesting that you had a period where you got into and fell out of interest in Zen philosophy. Interesting you call it a philosophy, but I'll withhold my comments there. My general impression, although I may be misinterpreting, is that your major issue was with the concept of awakening, is that it's antithetical to engagement with the world and seeks to basically escape by erasing the self. However, many of my mentors, and I tend to agree from personal experience, claim that the erasure of the illusion of the self paradoxically allows for greater expressive freedom, that the point is not to escape reality, but to accept all aspects of it, including the dissatisfactory parts, tanha, which means thirsting or craving. maybe it's just my cherry picking of the tradition, but at least for me, or at least for my philosophical development, it feels extremely synergistic with what little I've read of Nietzsche. For a concrete example, it seems to me that this type of natural expression and acceptance of what your physiology gives you in the moment is profoundly Nietzschean, not to turn away from the hardships of life, but to face it with lucidity and honesty. I would be super curious to hear where you believe the disagreement lies. Well, I will say one thing about where it doesn't lie. It's not with the erasure of the illusion of the self, because interestingly, Nietzsche also does the same thing, doesn't he? I mean, it's in the four great errors in Twilight of Idols. And really everything I was just saying about the critique of the will and really the simple picture of this arbitrarily governing ego consciousness that gives directives to the self and serves as an inner core of the self, I think Nietzsche's all on board with critiquing that idea in really very similar terms to the terms used by the Buddhists. That much of the postmodern, so-called postmodern deconstruction of selfhood, identity, and so on really draws upon the things the Buddhists have been saying in pre-modern times for 2,500 years about dependent origination. So I think Nietzsche is fully on board with that. But then we have that issue you talk about of engagement with the world, of the fact that the world does appear a certain way, and it may be more life-preserving or life-enhancing to throw yourself into the immediate appearance. And as you bring up, Zen could be argued to do this, that contrary to other forms of Buddhism, there is more about accepting even the dissatisfactory parts of existence. The Zen texts are littered with repudiations of this whole idea of trying to go beyond the human and trying to make yourself into a Buddha. And all of these, it gets incredibly complicated with Zen and the different schools of thought that existed, because then this might lead you to a kind of immanentist position where you are the Buddha already. And then you might ask, well, then what's the point of doing Zen practice at all? Why am I sitting around meditating all the time? And I believe in Dogen's Shobogenzo, he responds to this with the whole idea that the wind is ever present, but this doesn't mean that you don't need to flap your fan in order to get the wind to blow in the way that you want it to blow, right? That it starts from like one master talking to another saying, why are you, fanning yourself if the air is everywhere? And this is an analogy to Buddha nature. Buddha is everywhere, Buddha is everything, and yet to get the Buddha nature working, something like that, you need to sit, right? You need to sit zazen. And by that means you become a Buddha. In that moment, you're already a Buddha, you're already enlightened. And there's that claim throughout Zen. You are enlightened even in the moment of your delusion. There's actually no distinction between delusion and enlightenment. And by the way, it's very hard to square a lot of this with the claims made in the Pali Canon, where I've brought this up before, but the Buddha's final words are, work out your own salvation with diligence. And, Theravada Buddhism is non-dualistic in the sense of anatman, no self, but it's not non-dualistic epistemologically, kind of in the way that Zen is, if that makes any sense. In other words, in the Pali Canon, there's a real difference. There's a truth to saying that there's a difference between a Buddha and an ordinary person, and it's false to claim otherwise. So Zen is a real departure from earlier forms of Buddhism, even from some other forms of Mahayana Buddhism, which do contain some of the same Zen flexibility, right, with making these apparently mutually exclusive statements that enlightenment and delusion are the same, the enlightened master and the ordinary person are the same. There's Buddha nature is in everyone. You're already liberated at every moment. It's just sort of like a matter of realizing your liberation, something like that. And so, to get to the point in answering your question of like what my issue is with Zen, my issue is actually contained in that very proposition, that very difference from ordinary Buddhism, that if there is no difference between the enlightened master and the ordinary person, then from my perspective, there is no point in me engaging in Zen philosophy or practice. because the Zen masters tell you over and over again, the thing you're trying to get is not something that you get by practice. That's not something that you attain. There's nothing attained. They all say, I attained nothing from perfect, peerless enlightenment. And the Zen stories are just full of this. And so people take this and they try to like walk this contradictory line. And as I've mentioned, the Zazen-focused schools of Zen, which seem to be, by the way, there have been many disputations over the history of Zen of like what Zen actually consists of in terms of a practice, what it actually indicates. And not everyone agreed with this sitting meditation thing and the centrality of sitting meditation. In fact, it almost seems as if there were periods in which, or schools of thought in which they were rebuking the whole practice of sitting meditation as a way of attaining enlightenment. And it's worth pointing out as well, there's not really many Zen stories of people sitting and then attaining enlightenment. Now, that is Buddha's story, interestingly enough, in the Pali Canon, right? But the Zen stories all involve like people being enlightened in dialogues, which is very interesting. And so that leads to this whole thing of koan study and doing all that. But the point is, like, what is the outcome? What is the objective of doing any of this? If I take the Zen masters at their word, that there's actually no difference between the enlightened person and the ordinary person, then I'm done. I can stop thinking about this. And I did treat it as like a real sort of spiritual struggle. And I realized at a certain point, I'm like, oh, they're telling me actually, this is not a struggle. You're binding yourself in your own chains right now with this whole struggle that you're carrying out to try and like get enlightenment or whatever the hell. Again, I think the only way that whole quest makes any sense is if you actually take a more like serious, empirical Theravada standpoint and say, yeah, there's like a real thing called Buddhahood that I am trying to get, and it takes a lot of work and practice, and there is a difference. And the reason why people don't believe that in Western meditation is because they don't believe in samsara and like the reincarnation piece of it. They're mostly, people who are meditating in the West are atheists who think it's like, oh, you want to be liberated from your desires? Well, you'll get that when you die anyway. So, like, is it really, it might be nice to get enlightened, but if you believe that's some sort of like psychological state or something, that you can explain in like secular terms, but if there's no spiritual dimension to it, if it doesn't have to do with like a different kind of birth or exiting the wheel of birth, if that isn't real, it kind of changes the whole issue, doesn't it? And the thing is, most people in the West are not looking for a new series of religious dogmas or supernatural beliefs. They're actually trying to escape from the supernatural dogmas of Western religion. And they like Buddhism because it has these elements to it which are more empirical. It has these elements to it which are seem less like pious and holy or like judgmental, right? It's like, okay, you can commit this sin, right? You can follow one of the 3 poisons and be ignorant and unenlightened, but you're just hurting yourself ultimately at the end of the day. You're not like offending the pride of some god. And Buddhism says, you shouldn't worship the gods, right? The important thing is attaining Buddhahood. So it's very focused on the actual human life in that way. And so there's all these things that Westerners find attractive about it. But the core of the religion, I mean, unless it really is just like, okay, meditation helps me, like you're bad at regulating your emotions or something, or you just need help. It just helps you in doing it, right? Or it helps you sort through your thoughts. It helps you get out of destructive or self-defeating thought patterns. If Zen for you is just sort of like exercising, right? It's like emotional, mental, spiritual exercise, whatever we want to call it. Cool. I mean, that's fine. That's, to me though, that has nothing to do with like the philosophy of like enlightenment. And by the way, enlightenment is the central thing of Zen. It's very hard to say that it's not if you look at the 4 statements. The point of Zen is to see your nature and become a Buddha. And yet they also simultaneously make the claim that you're a Buddha already and there's nothing to attain and you don't have to see anything and you're already there. So that's all that I did. I mean, you could say I completed it myself. I completed Zen. I was like, I'm going to believe what the masters are telling me. There's no difference, and I'm going to go on with my life. And I'm not going to have this whole spiritual struggle anymore. And I don't need to sit in order to see my Buddha nature or anything like that. There's no difference between my Buddha nature and somebody who sits all day, every day, like Bodhidharma staring at the cave wall for 9 years. And, the thing is, if some people will make this claim that they're over it. They're like, yeah, I've realized there's nothing to get in enlightenment, but they're still doing the Zen practice. And I think people get very suspicious of claims like the one I'm making in the Zen context, because it's like, if you say the things that I'm saying, you would have to say, I believe I am enlightened, basically, right? Because the mark of the enlightened master is that he knows there's no difference between enlightenment and the ordinary state. But see, that's actually not what I'm saying. I'm saying, I'm not saying it's all like fake, it's all a ruse or a con job. Maybe it was. I'm just saying I took the masters at their word that there's no difference here. It's sort of like a self-collapsing system. So, I mean, again, like the exercise element of it, if it's like a mental exercise for you, cool. As a life philosophy of reducing your suffering, cool. That's all great. I don't need it anymore, is the simple fact. Like, why do I need it? What do I need to get out of Zen? I threw myself into it. I learned a lot about the tradition. I sucked the marrow out of that. And then I moved on. And for me, I do. That's why I said it's funny you call it philosophy, because I feel like you can only really call it philosophy when you're kind of outside the tradition, and you do just see it as another philosophical category. It's like a literary category. It's like reading all the Zen stories was a sort of a literary period in my life or something like that. But asking me like, well, what's your problem with it? Why don't you go back to it now? It's like, well, I read all the books. I did all the things. I think I got the point. And I don't feel any need to do it anymore. I'm not looking for anything anymore that Zen can give me. And that's the thing. It's funny. It's like arguing with a Hegelian, where they'll say that actually being anti-Hegel is to be dialectical, which capitulates to Hegel. There are people who will hear this who will be like, that's very Zen of you. It's like, all right, is there no way out of this thing? That's how you know it's a cult. They're always trying to say, well, they're always trying to suck you back in, right? I joke, but, I really don't mean it in that way. I really do not. Like, I really am just kind of over it. That's really the answer. It's not really a deep disagreement with it. It's just I got over it. I was like, okay, if I really take the tradition seriously, at the end of the day, all it is just like sort of like a mental exercise, and I didn't feel like I was getting anything out of that that I can't get from, like most of the time I would do walking meditation, and then I kind of realized, I'm like, oh, walking meditation is actually just walking. Like if you're not, like a lot of people when they walk, they put in earbuds and they do like, and I do that too sometimes, but I used to do it a lot more. But that's, I guess, my meditation. Nietzsche did walking meditation when he would just go on a hike by himself, right? So I don't really need any special practice or anything anymore. I think I have it figured out. I mean, I guess the only other thing I haven't mentioned is community, like having a Sangha. And I wasn't a part of a Sangha. I was a typical Westerner who didn't join part of the, I wasn't looking for a community, really. I was engaged in really the same kind of thing that we talk about here, this singular individual philosophical introspection, which doesn't, actually lend itself to community very well. I've always been more of the Heraclitean, Kierkegaardian, Nietzschean type of personality. So maybe that accounts for it. It's just a personality difference. Like the few times I went to the Zen Center, I was like, I don't know, it was kind of uncomfortable. I don't like just sitting in a room with all these people I don't really know. And I didn't really want to get to know them. As Alan Watts says, a lot of these really spiritual people who have their higher self thing going, they're just like ordinary people. And a lot of the time, they're actually a little worse than average people. So, again, no shade. I learned a lot from Zen. I enjoyed it. Everyone should explore it. But that contradiction at the heart of it, I think, is real. And I guess my final note on it, if you're wondering, it's like you have to, this is actually one of the central things in the Zen tradition, by the way, meditating on the koan of Jiaoju's dog and doing the Huadu meditation, where you focus on the single turning word and what does it mean. what is the nature of no, denial, negation, when Jiaozhu answers no? What does that mean? And I spent a lot of time meditating on that when I was involved in Zen. And so I guess what I would say is, eventually you need a yes and no, a straight line, a goal, right? That's what Nietzsche says, formula for our happiness. And there are those who say, yeah, enlightenment and ordinary are the same, but also, yes, enlightenment. That is what I'm looking for. And there are people, I guess like me, who say, yeah, they're the same, and no, enlightenment, I'm not looking for it. You kind of hold this contradiction in your mind if you want to be part of the Zen tradition. And I said, but ultimately your actions, performatively, are revealing what you've said yes to and what you've said no to. And eventually I did say no to Zen, right? Definitively, yeah. So that's my answer. I don't know if it's satisfactory to you, but that's as honest as I can be about it, really. As I realized, I was like, oh, I don't believe in this enlightenment thing, and the masters actually told me not to believe in it. So there it is. Okay, let's go to Paul Lazar. He says, hi, Keegan. Paul here, the actor from New York. You have a very legitimate aversion to hypothesizing about what Nietzsche would think of contemporary situations. So I reluctantly ask about Elon Musk and Curtis Yarvin. Even though they nauseate me personally, I do wonder whether Nietzsche would admire their mammoth achievements and their anti-egalitarian, anti-democracy, pro-aristocratic spirit. Are they Ubermensch? Thank you, Paul. Although I do have to say, I'm guessing that there's like some tongue-in-cheek here. I really don't... One of the things I've tried to combat is people asking, is this person the Ubermensch? Of just getting people to understand how that's a category error, because that's like asking, are they God? Right? This is the highest value of Nietzsche's system. It's not... I guess what people are focusing on is like maybe there is like a really important or motivating thing about the idea of being the Ubermensch, right? Of like that the Ubermensch will actually be material. He will actually exist in the world, that the Ubermensch will be real. But for me, the thing is, like, I think it's really important that it's in the distant future. And it's also important to understand the way Nietzsche talked about actual higher men, which I don't think we need to go into. The thing is, most of the time, they don't turn out well. They don't meet their full potential. Most of the time, they are crushed. Most of the time, they're botched or they're badly turned out. And in addition to this, the fact that Nietzsche never talks about becoming the overman. Like, if that was really an important thing, you'd think Nietzsche would have talked about it, but he doesn't. He talks about bringing forth the overman. So I think that's just like a way we need to reorient the way we talk about it. But I don't think you're actually making that error. It's an excuse for me to talk about one of my pet peeves is people asking constantly, is this person the overman? And it reveals like they haven't really read Zarathustra or they don't really get it. And it's always people that I'm like, there's no way that they're the overman. Come on. So, and then the people you ask about Elon Musk and Curtis Yarvin, the other issue I'd have with this question is like, I don't think those two belong in the same category because on the one hand, you say that they're mammoth accomplishments or achievements. Does Curtis Yarvin have any mammoth achievements? He writes a blog that's been very culturally influential. So to that degree, I guess I have mammoth cultural achievements. I don't know if I'm on Yarvin's level yet, but one day I will be. So, it's like, I don't know if that compares to like Elon Musk. I know people can dispute. It's like to what degree Elon Musk himself is responsible for SpaceX or Tesla or all of these innovations or whatever. I guess I'll just say you do need in the capitalist system, you do need like the idea man to throw money at things and helm these projects. It is worth saying that in the era that we're in, where like the U.S. government's apparently given up on space exploration, people think it's a very bad development that CEOs are the ones doing it. But what if it's between that and no space exploration? That's a serious question, by the way. I'm not saying there's like a definitive answer, but it might be to where private industry is the only way that we continue exploring space at this point. That the idea of a government doing it is just not going to happen in the future. So, I don't know what the answer to that is. I'm personally I don't have much admiration for Elon Musk or really any of these captains of industry. I don't have any antipathy for them. Like I don't have, what does he say? They nauseate you personally. I'm not personally nauseated by any of these people. I look at people and I see a type. I look at people and I see these timeless archetypes of human beings just repeating endlessly. I don't see all these free agents that I judge morally. Maybe that's legitimately the way that I'm different from most people. I look at everyone and I just see these repeating, recurring types. I see forces. I see nature. I don't have this investment in the drama that's playing out around me that all the rest of you seem to have. I really don't. And maybe that's a way in which I'm Nietzschean. Maybe that's just like a temperamental thing with me. That like if it wasn't Elon Musk, there'd be some other guy that would be like him that would fill into that role. And yeah, I agree with Nietzsche. Occasionally, they're like the individuality of the people who fill the role can be really important. But do I see like Elon Musk as being like this particularly dynamic, incredible guy that some people make him out to be? No. Do I find him to be like particularly repugnant and everything? Not really. Even his turn to supporting Trump in the right wing, it's like, is that really that crazy to you? Like on the liberal side, to see him make that turn? I mean, like, he's the richest man in the world. I mean, come on. So in any case, and all I'm saying by that is like what they care about is money and their ability to get into the government mechanisms to deregulate, which is exactly what he's used the administration to do, to whatever degree he's actually been successful. It's like that's what every businessman wants. There's so much about the current administration's agenda that is just what the Republicans have said they've wanted for a long time. That's not really a massive departure that it's often made out to be. I mean, I guess we could argue about how extreme it is, right? But we don't need to get into the weeds with all that. My point is that I don't see the obsession with Elon Musk is another one of those things that doesn't make much sense to me. He's not that interesting to me as a figure, in the same way that when people ask me about Andrew Tate, he's not very interesting. Now, all of this does not really apply to Curtis Yarvin, because Curtis Yarvin actually is like a very interesting political theorist. Again, you might disagree with everything that he has to say, but I would put Yarvin's writings up there with like the great reactionary thinkers like de Maistre and Thomas Carlyle. I mean, Nietzsche himself to some degree. And I mean, I remember I read a thing by Yarvin a long time ago about how like modern day progressivism can be seen as an outgrowth of Calvinism. He called it like ultra Calvinism, basically, or like hyper Calvinism. It's so Calvinist that it transcends like the superstitions and the religious trappings and becomes just purely like this moralistic ideology, world picture, something like that. And that very much fit with what my understanding based on Nietzsche and his understanding of like morality as a sort of like mimetic and religion as a delivery system for moral values. So, you should look at NRX, neo-reaction, in the same way that a mature thinker looks at Marxism. So Marxism is a tool. It's an interpretive lens. It's a perspective. It's pure ideology, as Zizek would say. I'm trying to think of other examples. So is neo-reaction. So is the whole movement that Curtis Yarvin started and thought. So, in the same way that you don't have to agree with Marx's vision for society, for a post-capitalist society, the abolition of private property, right, which is what Marx says you could kind of reduce communism down to, is that's their goal, is to abolish private property. You don't have to agree with that goal, but you can still read Capital and understand that Marx makes some very interesting points economically about, say, falling rate of profit, about commodity fetishism, about capital taking on its own logic that supersedes the individual wills of the people operating within the system. All of those things are very, very important. And honestly, because of the connection of Nick Land, who used to be a Marxist in the whole Dark Enlightenment thing, they actually carry on in NRX a lot of that same like Marxist perspective on economics, or like Marxist critiques of liberalism, frankly. Now, Similarly, you don't have to agree with a return to monarchy, which is, I guess, the most bold-faced statement of Curtis Yarvin's goal, to notice the things that he points out about, like, the cathedral and the way in which the cathedral is a very interesting idea, because it's the idea of, like, this sort of consensus, this social cultural consensus that's maintained without any centralized power structure, right? So in the German, like, Nazi Gestapo or whatever, where you had like Goebbels, like the propaganda minister, like makes everyone say the same thing, or like the Soviet system, it's a centralized system of control. Yarvin presents a theory of like how you could have a decentralized system of narrative control. Again, do you agree with that or not? You don't even have to agree on the other side with Marx's economics. You don't have to agree with his economic theories. But when you practice seeing the world through a Marxist lens, it can reveal something to you, because sometimes, at least sometimes, and I don't think anyone could dispute this, sometimes the Marxists are correct about the way the world works. Sometimes. And I think sometimes the neo-reactionaries have been correct about the way things work. And you can say that without sharing any of their goals for society, right? And so I think Curtis Yarvin should not be unfairly thrown in with Elon Musk, because in spite of whatever you want to say about him, he actually has some interesting political theories that, like, I think have to be reckoned with in the modern world if you want to dialogue with the right these days, because the right has taken on, like, you may not like it, but this is the thing. This has been the big thing, right? Is like the IDW types, the Jordan Petersons and Douglas Murray and James Lindsay types. I've pointed out recently that they have always sounded the theme of free speech, but their project has always been about excluding things. What do I mean by that? Well, Jordan's whole project from the beginning was that Marxism, communism should be treated as being just as bad as Nazism, right? Like the atrocities that happened during World War II and afterwards are just as bad as what the Nazis did, if not worse. So we should make that verboten to talk about. You can't, like, why don't the Marxists have to answer for the crimes of Stalin, right? Was sort of one of his original points that he came onto the scene arguing. And throughout this whole thing, that whole clique, they've always gone after the postmodernists, the neo-Marxists, critical theory. These are all horrible ideas, right? Why are they horrible ideas? Well, they frame it as free speech. These people don't believe in debate. They don't believe in truth. So how can you debate with them? So therefore, the only thing we can do is exclude them from the debate, right? Do you see that the sleight of hand that's going on there? That the entire thing was based on, don't engage with critical theory. Don't engage with postmodernism. Don't engage with Marxism. We should present a new Overton window where we're just above that, and that's not okay to talk about anymore. And so, in spite of everything that they've done, arguing for free speech, their project was really not about free speech. It was really about making this smear campaign against basically every left-wing strand of philosophy that has existed. And that, part of that you could say is tactical. They're going after the fact that left-wing philosophy was like dominating the academy. And so it's like it's a reaction against that. And maybe you could say that's like justified to some extent, that there should be more of a balance. The problem is their claim was never that there should be more of a balance. It was for more restriction of like, just centrist neoliberal capitalist realism thought. That's all we're going to have. We're going to go to college and kids will read Mill and Hayek, and they'll read John Rawls, and they'll read, maybe John Rawls is even too liberal for these people, but you know what I'm saying, right? Everything's just the current consensus. Well, I think that was all a bad move. And I think that was all very close-minded. And I think we've seen the effects of how close-minded that has made. Many of the people who posture themselves as intellectual in the right wing have not read a single thing philosophically from what left-wing philosophers have written. They have not read any Marxist theory. They have not read any postmodernist. They have not read any critical theory. And they think that this is somehow like an own, that they're like, I don't even have to engage with that. Well, that was all very stupid. It's made them stupid, because when you don't actually practice your arguments against your opponents, you get weaker. I mean, I don't know what else to tell you. So the left should probably not make the same mistake, even though they have, because, and I'm certainly not saying, oh, you should read what Nazis have to say, but Curtis Yarvin's not a Nazi. For one, he's Jewish. I know that's like, some people don't consider that to be an argument, but I think it is actually an argument. And, you may not agree with anything he has to say, but in the same way that I think a conservative should read Marxism and actually take it seriously and be able to actually go toe-to-toe with those arguments and deconstruct them if they want to have an opinion about it. I think Curtis Yarvin has become an influential thinker on the right, and if you're against this kind of unitary strong executive thinking on the right wing of we're going to smash through all of the regulations, destroy the bureaucracy, do all of this, that, and the other, and you think that's all a bad idea, have you read the arguments for why they want to do that? Well, a lot of them come from Curtis Yarvin. So it's not about, my moral valuation of him as a thinker. It's like, you have to read this stuff to be informed if you want to get involved in that political debate in philosophy. Now, thankfully for myself, as you say, I have an aversion to all of that, getting involved in these contemporary political debates. So I wouldn't actually put that standard to myself. I don't read all of the political theory from both sides. But, if I was like trying to make an economic argument about where the country should go, I would feel it was incumbent on me to familiarize myself with not only the right wing, but also the left wing economic theories, right? And the same thing with like political theory. And I think a lot of this stuff is very interesting. Like, that's the other thing I don't really get with a lot of people's mindset, where they're reading something they really disagree with that they think is like evil, and it doesn't excite them. It like upsets them. And I think there is a certain personality type that is going to skew more Nietzschean. That I read something that I completely disagree with, but if it's like argued really well and it's like challenging my beliefs, I get excited. I don't get like disgusted. I'm like, it's like a thrill ride, It's like a horror film, right? You read some Nick Land, and if you actually start to say like, oh, wow, this guy's got a point, it's like a really scary thing. And so it's very thrilling in that way to think, could this guy be right? And that's like sort of my case for reading some of the stuff that like, it's actually very interesting, very fun. And that's the level of engagement I have with it, is that it's all for me, philosophy is a luxury. It's a pleasure. I'm not out here trying to change the world. And that's sort of what I'm standing for here. But so, yeah, I wouldn't pair Elon Musk and Curtis Yarvin. And I would say, I guess your question is, would Nietzsche admire? I don't think he would admire Elon Musk. I think he would think he was a bit of an absurd character in some ways. Even if he might agree with him, at least like superficially on some political things, right? But I don't think he would see Elon Musk as a deep thinker. And whereas Curtis Yarvin, I don't know what Nietzsche would think of Curtis Yarvin. He would probably think he was an interesting thinker. Nietzsche also famously disliked Carlyle and thought he was boring. I think Nietzsche was very, really focused on style, and I don't think he would like Yarvin's style, the style of, making these banal pop culture references to explain his ideas, like occasionally playing to the masses in that way, and otherwise and then lapsing into like very analytical and very sort of stylistically boring but dense like argument, like when he gets into talking about economics and stuff sometimes. I think Nietzsche would dislike his style very much, but as far as Yarvin's actual arguments, I think he actually is commensurate with Nietzsche on many points. I think monarchy is ultimately the end of Nietzsche's political philosophy, insofar as like Nietzsche's Bonapartism. There is an important difference, though, in that Yarvin, I think, correctly points out that the king, the monarch, is typically more aligned with the populace and ends up being paradoxically a sort of populist force against the aristocracy. And Yarvin sees our current aristocracy as basically a bureaucratic oligarchy. And the funny thing about Nietzsche is he's for aristocracy. The wars between the kings and the aristocrats, that's all what would you say? Perhaps that's like can be a productive conflict, right? That's all in good fun. Those are the testing conflicts that have to happen. And if an aristocracy can't survive a Caesar, it doesn't deserve to exist, might be something we would say. But ultimately, Nietzsche, I think, is more pro-aristocracy than he is pro-monarch. It's almost like that the Caesar is like the best aristocrat that emerges at the end once an aristocracy has delegitimized itself and is destined to fall. You get like the last best guy, right? But ultimately, I think that stasis is the wrong word. It is, or it's like a homeostasis of oligarchy. I think Nietzsche is very much in favor of. Whereas Yarvin, it's not clear to me that he is. I think he is more in favor of monarchy, and he does like prefer to like divine right of kings, kind of old school understanding of the monarch as like this cultural unifying figure and so on and so forth. Like there's like a real argument that the monarch is the best thing for the herd, right? That I think would, that Nietzsche might even agree with and say, yeah, well, that's why I'm pro-aristocracy. And the times when I like a monarch, it's like a Caesar or a Napoleon, right? It's like in those extreme measures are needed. I'm kind of rambling here, but like, so there's important differences between them. I would reframe how you think about these figures, because Yarvin, you should look at him as like, this is the intellectual roots of like a whole movement. You should take it seriously. It's not just, don't adopt this attitude of chuckling dismissively at these ideas like many on the left wing do. And don't be like these right wing IDW types who are like, I don't have to read anything about Marxism because it's all hogwash. That's all close-minded nonsense. But good question. I mean, I like being able to kind of tease out the differences here. It's like, why? Because a lot of people would put Elon Musk and Curtis Yarvin in the same sentence, where I don't think they really belong in the same sentence. And good question. Okay, let's go to Hospiz. Has the question, in Twilight of Idols, on the section discussing Renan, Nietzsche, contrary to what he says Renan does, says something to the effect of, isn't it evident that science is democratic? Could you steelman this claim? Is there reason to believe that this isn't erroneous in the slightest? Okay, in the slightest, all right. Well, I don't know if Nietzsche would even say that it's not erroneous in the slightest. I think all of our judgments on these things are going to be errors. I mean, truth is a kind of error, remember that. So, there's that to say, but, that could be seen as a cop-out. I mean, what is Nietzsche saying there? He's saying that science is... he contrasts it with Renan, who thinks that science is aristocratic. And by the way, I think that there are some passages in Wills of Power where Nietzsche says similar things, that there's this sort of the cool-headed rationalism of the aristocrat a la Voltaire is definitive of the 17th century and the Enlightenment project. So even Nietzsche himself will occasionally make claims like this, but what does he mean when he says that science is democratic? I'm actually going to refer here to Horkheimer and Adorno, some critical theorists whose work I'm crunching through right now, and their dialectic of enlightenment, and the idea that, so they talk about really what enlightenment is as being, I'm going to give you the short version of the argument, that the Enlightenment is knowledge pursued for the reason that knowledge is power, that there was always the understanding that knowledge is power, that the Enlightenment is sort of knowledge as power, and the historical, material, instantiated form of knowledge as power is technology. And we could also say that the historical, the materially instantiated form of how we produce technology is science, right? So these things are all related, but that there's a power element in knowledge from the very beginning. And so in any case, technology, right? Knowledge as power. They make a claim very early in the text, actually, that technology is certainly as democratic as the economic system which birthed it. That scientific knowledge or technological advancement belongs no more to the king as his right than to anyone else. And I mean, we might ask, like, what is the economic system that they're referring to that births Enlightenment, science, and technology? I mean, they're referring to mercantile capitalism, which dawns into being around the same time. That there's this element in capitalism of democratizing, in the sense that it recognizes no claims of birth. Yes, people still inherit wealth, and that gives them power. That gives them perhaps means of production, to put it in Marxist terms. But nevertheless, that doesn't stop somebody, a parvenu who comes from out of nowhere, from simply having an idea and developing that idea and creating a new technology, and all of a sudden, they run the biggest company now. So there's something entrepreneurial about the power of knowledge that allows the disruption of existing power structures. But there's something that's like double-sided about saying that it's just as democratic as the economic system that birthed it, right? Because capitalism is not democratic certainly not purely democratic in the political sense. I mean, just to use the analogy that people vote with their dollars, well then by that standard, then those with more dollars get more votes. So that's not purely democratic in that way. Is a system where some people get more votes democratic? Well, in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. I mean, it's democratic in that everyone might have a say, but some people have more of a say than others, right? Obviously. So the fact of the matter is science, the historical material instantiation of science in the form of technology, knowledge as power, is democratic, quote unquote, in that way. No claim of nobility gives you a greater claim on science, or even the ability to use it more effectively, or anything like that. And we might also think of the comments that he makes about Socrates. Why is it that dialectic, that subjecting claims to doubt, to a methodology of doubt, why does that come from the plebeian class of society? Well, you only need to question things when the status quo isn't working for you. That's to put it very, very simply and straightforwardly, again, like oversimplifying things. But reason has this really important function in Socratic philosophy of universalism, in that all must answer to reason. That presumably anyone who can see reason has to behave reasonably, or that we all attempt, you could say this is a faith, a Socratic faith, but it might be true at least to some extent that we all believe that we behave reasonably. We might be acting on wrong information, we might be reasoning faultily, but there's this idea that if I can show you that, if I can prove to you in a way that you would agree with that your own actions are unreasonable according to the goals that you want to meet, presumably most people would say, oh, well, then I should do something different then. I have to change my behavior. I have to change my outlook. And so there's this Socratic faith in reason as binding on all men, on the minds of everyone. And so that would be my steelman for science as being obviously democratic from Nietzsche's perspective, is that science presents a world of objective truth claims that are valid in all times and all places, regardless of who you are, regardless of your perspective, right? And that would maybe be the basis where you could have an aristocratic view is perspectivism, right? It's a very dangerous idea to contemplate, right? The idea that people just have different viewpoints depending on where they are, or their birth, or their upbringing, or their culture. I think that that's true, and I do believe in pluralism in that sense, but it could also lead you to the view. That's the only way that, like, there is a presupposition in... The presupposition of perspectivism is almost required to have an aristocratic viewpoint, that the aristocrats are different in some way, because that requires you to put forward the idea that different people have different perspectives according to their status or their birth, right? If you can't put that idea forward, then you can't say the aristocrats have a greater command of reason or are more truthful, or all these claims that ancient societies made. So that is a very interesting thing, that you could see perspectivism as very postmodern. On the other hand, it's sort of the basis for the fact of like nobility, like in the political sense, in the social sense. And so in this way, science, technology, knowledge in that sense is very egalitarian, in that it does not recognize titles of nobility. It does not recognize that different people might have, like, that you could have a different science, right? Depending on where you're from, or what your status is, or all of these things, who and what you are. No, your science ought to be the same. And isn't that the claim that the scientific positivists make? That if you were to eliminate, say, all the religious documents in the world, burn every last one of them, the religions that people would form in future generations would all be different. Whereas if you were to burn every scientific textbook eventually the science they created would be the same. And so that's the evidence. That's this self-evident fact that science is democratic. It would always be the same for everyone in that way. Now, does that mean that, again, this doesn't mean that it's in practice always democratic. In the same way that technology, and the way that Horkheimer and Adorno talk about it, is no more or less democratic than capitalism, which means it is and it isn't at the same time. You could say, again, to oversimplify it greatly, meritocratic would be the term, which is, people would say, oh, well, it's the equality of opportunity instead of outcome. That's actually wrong as well, because in capitalism, people do have unequal opportunities. I mean, are you kidding? The son of a billionaire has an unequal opportunity from the son of, a beggar. That's just a fact. So it's not equal opportunity. That's not the issue. The issue is that, according to your merit, your ability to harness these forces of whether it might be reason or, to use technology, to use your skills in concert with technology, you could advance yourself according to how far you can go without having these artificial limitations placed on you based on birth, right? That is really the sense in which science is democratic, something like that. Like we might say that in academia, where science is studied and practiced, it's supposed to be solely based on the merit of your mind, right? Now, is that true in practice? No, but, that's what it is. It's the science in essence is democratic, we might say. And that I think it is. There can't be any scientific aristocracy of only we are the ones, unless you were to literally adopt the idea that, there is a way in which you could have, I gave the steel man already, but perhaps my siding with the other position is like the Francis Bacon New Atlantis scientists, something like that. The idea of like a sort of like academy of like a literal ivory tower of experts who are withdrawn from the world, who are like their scientific knowledge is held above like the religion or popular prejudice or something like that. Like the people who can transcend all of these things. That is an interesting idea in and of itself as well. It doesn't really get much play these days because I think many of the people who would be amenable to aristocratic views on things, right? Frankly speaking, the right wing, as we mentioned, increasing Yarvin influence among them, are also the kind of people who will be completely allergic to the idea of that aristocracy being scientists or experts. Think about what the associations with that are. They don't want to be managed by technocrats. They want like an old school aristocracy of blood. So that Francis Bacon idea has kind of died. But nevertheless, I mean, if there is going to be an aristocracy, I would say Bacon's version, a scientific aristocracy, would probably be the best one. Or maybe not. I mean, I don't know. See, that's the thing, is like you look at all the ways in which scientists can be very unwise people. So I don't really know the answer, but I think I've answered your question. I think that is the way in which science is, in essence, democratic, in that the same way that reason or knowledge is democratic, and even if it doesn't always shake out that way in practice. And Hospice also asks, is there an episode where you discuss sklaverei at all in good detail, which is German for slavery? Well, I mean, does Nietzsche discuss slavery in good detail? Not really. I mean, to the extent that he does, you might say the slave morality. I have discussed the master and slave morality in detail in the episodes we've done on genealogy of morals. I guess the episode on the Greek state, the episode is called Nietzsche's Contest on Spotify, and I think on YouTube it's like, the thumbnail's like Resurrecting Antiquity, Nietzsche's Battle with Modernity is something like the name of it, and where I talk about the Greek state and Homer's contest, and sort of sum up Nietzsche's political engagement with the Greeks, and there's a bit on it there, but I mean, Nietzsche himself doesn't talk about it a whole lot. I mean, he does talk about how, there's that famous saying, anyone who doesn't have 2/3 of his day to himself is a slave, whether he be called, whatever his title might be. So even the president of the United States is a slave, according to Nietzsche, right? He's the chief public servant. Like, we've created a system where we're all slaves. We're eliminating leisure time. We're eliminating odium. We are making everyone a useful cog in the machine. And while we're obscuring the fact from ourselves that we're enslaving everyone to, I don't know what, like utilitarian progress, like this mindless machine. Maybe it is, the Marxist thing would say, just generating capital efficiency. Maybe the right-wing thing would say making everyone into a cog so they can live in a pod and eat the bugs, control everyone or something like that. Maybe it's a system of control. Or maybe it's just, it's like, it's just the logic. Personally, my belief is it's just the underlying logic of utilitarianism is really what's driving all of modernity. And Nietzsche's argument would be, we've obscured the fact that we are enslaving ourselves to this system by these ideas of like dignity of man and dignity of labor, that even as we make people into wage slaves, we'll say, well, like that's a dignified position. And we'll try and like obscure that and hide the power relationships that govern human life. We'll try and hide what's actually going on, obscure it from ourselves. And so many people will talk about Nietzsche's aristocratic radicalism, but they won't talk about the ways in which he would be very critical of our own society now and would say we don't have democracy, we don't have egalitarianism now. That's all a lie. And I say he would say, he actually literally did say that about their society, that we are obscuring all of these old power relations that have always been there. That's one of the interesting things about Adorno and Horkheimer's book, that once we get into it, is that he kind of talks about how Enlightenment attacked myth, it demythologized the world, and yet within myth already contained all the elements of Enlightenment, and Enlightenment itself is a myth. And so all of the old forms of power and coercion and aggression and irrationality, all of these things return and they come back. And we say, how could they come back after 500 years of Enlightenment? And Adorno and Horkheimer would say, well, it never left. It was always just a sublation of that same underlying thing. So yeah, I'll be very interested to talk more about that during those episodes. But I hope I'm being clear. I hope I'm making sense. There's a lot of, I remember looking through all these questions being like, these are pretty straightforward, but they're actually taking me into some interesting territory where I'm having to think about paradoxes and contradictory ideas and, squaring circles and all that. So good questions from everybody, actually. Thank you very much for these. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Malachi Hudson. Malachi asks, 1, how does Deleuze's thought differ from Nietzsche? That's actually kind of a complicated question, because if you were to just read Nietzsche and philosophy, you might think their thought doesn't differ much at all. I mean, obviously Deleuze interprets Nietzsche for his own ends, but maybe like from Deleuze's own perspective, that he would say he simply incorporated Nietzsche into his philosophy in perhaps the same way, Schopenhauer differs from Kant, but Schopenhauer incorporates Kant into his philosophy. Schopenhauer would say, I understand the true meaning of Kant. In the same way, Deleuze might say, I understand the true meaning of Nietzsche. And even if he might differ in his interpretation from maybe the way that others do it, I think he would say that his interpretation, he's in line with Nietzsche's ideas. On the other hand, he obviously innovates and adds things. He takes Nietzsche's will to power and kind of goes into this direction of desiring production. And then he develops all these new ideas of like the body without organs, which can be seen as a way of another kind of semiology for talking about will to power, something like that. I mean, the really obvious difference would be politically, right? Although it's not as cut and dry as a lot of people like to make it with Deleuze of just, he's on the left. One of the things that's often been pointed out about Anti-Oedipus, for example, is the complete lack of class analysis in that work. That Deleuze is kind of in that vein of leftist thought with Adorno and Horkheimer, who again we'll be covering fairly soon. The critical theory side of things, where the traditional Marxist class analysis is not really there to the same degree, or it's not centered in the same way. But Deleuze, nevertheless, so he differs a lot from the left, but he's not really in line with Nietzsche's politics by any stretch of the imagination. If he does take Nietzsche's politics in a certain direction, you could argue, and some people have, that there could be a potentially like an anarchist reading of Nietzsche, and that would seem to be perhaps the closest thing, where again it would be that he wouldn't interpret it as a direct difference with Nietzsche. I think he would say that he's developed, his own interpretation that nevertheless is commensurate with Nietzsche. But I would personally find that to be a big difference. And, there are my own problems with Deleuze's interpretation as well of like the eternal recurrence of the same. I think that's a huge difference with Nietzsche, ultimately, that for Deleuze, he has this differential ontology, which is ultimately, you could maybe make the argument that it's more purely an expression of Heraclitean becoming than even Nietzsche is with his project to stamp becoming with the character of being, with the eternal return. So I think, and we could also say with Deleuze, there's another big difference would be style. He's in that French milieu where there is, maybe they take some elements that Nietzsche kind of began, like psychoanalysis and philosophy, analysis of language as a basis for talking about philosophy, and they kind of heighten a lot of those things in ways that might set him at odds with Nietzsche, because Nietzsche does think there is, again, you could interpret will to power as as a way of grounding Nietzsche's perspective of reality. Not will to power, again, as a monistic world explanation, but of valuing as this fundamental reality prior to like the objective truth of a judgment. We have to concern ourselves with what value the judgment is aimed at. And this is, from a certain perspective, truly a universal statement that Nietzsche is making. So I don't know. It's a very complicated question. I could almost do, it might be good to, when we eventually do talk about more Deleuze, okay, I'll read your next question. Do you ever think you'll make a video or series about difference in repetition or anti-Oedipus / ATP, 1,000 Plateaus? Yeah, most likely yes. And I'm not sure how soon that will be, but when we do get there, that would be a great opportunity for talking about those differences as well. Malachi also asks, I really appreciate your response videos to Jordan Peterson. Do you think you will respond to his predecessor, Jonathan Pagaeu? I've never thought about that, but maybe I could. I don't have as good of a handle on Pagaeu and what he believes. I know he's orthodox. I know Peterson gets a lot of his ideas from him. I have seen him talk. I've seen him dialogue with some people. I saw him speak with Alex O'Connor. So I have some handle on kind of what he believes. I'm not exactly sure. What should I respond to? Maybe give me a comment, especially if you have any videos of him talking about Nietzsche, or if anyone's aware of that. That's always the best place for me to respond to people, because then it's not really about me and my personal opinion or disputes with them. It's about the question of interpretation, and that's where I can kind of proceed objectively analyzing. Well, not really truly objectively, but you all know what I mean. There's like a concrete basis for the discussion, we might say. So that, yeah, I would say that's very possible. I haven't really seen anything from him that I've needed to respond to, that I felt like I really had to. So let me know if he's talked about Nietzsche specifically. And then the last question you have here is thoughts on Radiohead, The Weeknd's new tour. That's like two questions. I don't know. I mean, I know who The Weeknd is. Are they on tour with Radiohead? Why are these in the same question? I don't really know anything about The Weeknd's new tour. Thoughts on Radiohead? I mean, I think I've been asked about Radiohead in a past Q&A. They were one of my favorite bands at a certain time in my life. They still are, kind of, in the way that I don't listen to them as much as I used to, but I can throw on one of their albums and I kind of know it like the back of my hand, and it's always fun to revisit them after a couple of years. And I think I've said it before, I came into Radiohead, hooked on the Kid A, OK Computer, Amnesiac kind of era. And then I gained more of an appreciation for the Bins and even Pablo Honey, like their first album. I think Pablo Honey is actually a great album. Radiohead fans always trash it, but especially as somebody who has a lot more appreciation for I guess grunge and just 90s alternative rock and that kind of thing. I think it's like a great album in that vein, that they obviously went a complete 180 from that style later. But the second half of Pablo Honey, there's something really interesting and creative going on there. It's sort of like, reading Nietzsche's early works. You can see some of the seeds of the ideas that are later. You can see the seeds of musical ideas in that. And I love that. And they also wear their influences on their sleeve. I love when bands that become great, you listen to their first album and it's like Metallica's first album is, in some ways just a Motorhead cover album. But it's interesting because they're not Motorhead. So they're doing it inevitably their personality comes out really strongly in the contrast between them and their influences, like inevitably. And that's like the really interesting thing to me. So I like raw, very derivative first albums. And some have argued that's what Pablo Honey is. And so I really enjoy that. But I like the whole kind of breadth of Radiohead's career. I haven't listened to their most recent albums, you know. I just haven't had, you know, I haven't gotten around to it. I think the direction they were going, kind of King of Limbs and post that, very similar to like Tom York's solo stuff in The Eraser. I like it. There's like 3 songs on King of Limbs that I really enjoyed, but I remember the majority of that album I was kind of bored by. And that was kind of my experience whenever I'd hear like a single from their new stuff. So not really that familiar with what they've been doing recently, but yeah, I like Radiohead. Who doesn't, you know? All right, Fire Skull asks, possibility for more episodes of Hegel down the line? Well, yeah, there's a possibility. I never know how to answer these questions. I mean, I guess you can kind of tell by how I react that it's probably there in my tone of voice that it's not necessarily something that's on my radar to do more on Hegel. I really covered Hegel as a prelude to Deleuze in some ways because it's very important to understand him as an anti-Hegelian and his reading of Nietzsche as anti-Hegelian. And it is important, the master and slave dialectic is probably the most important thing by Hegel you need to understand in relation to Nietzsche and the master and slave morality. So am I going to get into talking about phenomenology of spirit as a whole? You know, that's very hard for me to see that happening. I think what's more likely will be, I'm open to looking at interpreters of Hegel and maybe dialoguing with people who are Hegelian. There was actually somebody on Twitter who was a Hegelian, they pejoratively called them the Hegelian e-girls, which, you know, I think was kind of intended to be a put down. But this person, Nikki, the Hegelian, who I spoke to several times, and we talked about doing a podcast, and I kind of wanted to have her on because I don't really, you know, Hegel's just not my wheelhouse, and I feel out of my depth when I'm reading Hegel. It's not the way that I think, and I'm very much more in line with the Deleuzian interpretation of Hegel. That being said, I do have... I'm not one of those who takes that position of Hegelianism's a bunch of garbage and gibberish. I think that's just ignorant, and I've already kind of spoken about that kind of attitude earlier in regards to other questions. So you guys know how I stand on that. I'm open to talking about it. I am interested in Hegel. It's just not really my thing. I'll put it that way. So I'm not ruling it out, but yeah, I don't know. We'll see what the future holds. So we have a question from Juan Pablo Barreto. Nietzsche famously embraced pain, solitude, and adversity as paths to growth and self-realization. But when it comes to human connection, friendship, intimacy, sharing a life, it seems like this was the kind of Mount Vesuvius he chose not to build a city on. Was his loneliness his comfort zone, or was it done intentionally to realize his philosophical work? I'm interested to hear what you think about this. Well, thank you, Juan Pablo. So many ways to answer this question. I mean, in a way you could say, if somebody's life turns out a certain way, that's based on the choices they've made. And again, from a Nietzschean angle, that's not, an expression of libertarian free will. It's sort of the value judgments inherent in them, the drives inherent in them, who and what they are, and the fate that is destined to come into being in their character, the person that they're going to become. You could say that, was that intentional, or how do you put it here? Was it just his comfort zone? Like, I don't know, I'm guessing the contrast you're trying to draw is between intentionality and something that just sort of happens. I guess I would say that in broad strokes, those are the same thing, really, right? Is that you make all of these choices in life that may seem... You can easily sleepwalk through major decisions in life, and yet those decisions in some sense are still your inheritance. It's still the ones you were always going to make. you're still reacting according to what you value and what's driving you at every given moment. You're still a quanta of power expressing itself at every given moment, or really several quantums of power, something like that. And so, yeah, I don't think there's really a distinction there. I mean, the interesting thing that you're drawing attention to is the fact that that is a Mount Vesuvius, friendship, intimacy, sharing a life, as Sartre would later say in No Exit, or rather one of his characters says, which is quite literally a declaration of the discovery of what's happening in the short story, that hell is other people, that to be in hell is to have to be social. Such a French notion, right? But there's some truth to it, and that it is, you pick your poison. I mean, we've been speaking about the dangers of solitude at the end of The Gay Science, and Nietzsche was kind of talking about how you have to not speak so loud that you become your own echo chamber. You know, don't think your thoughts, the chord with which the world resides in you, so loudly that you just become your own self-contained world, your own star that collapses in on itself. That can happen in solitude, but you can then lose yourself easily in these social relations and bonds to others, which so often that is how we define ourselves. That's something Heidegger talks about. That's something Girard talks about, is even our desires often come from others, that our desires are not our own. They only appear to us that way. And that can be a Mount Vesuvius, that you can lose yourself. You can become, like, who you are authentically, whatever that might be, becomes indeterminate in the interrelation of yourself to every other person around you. And that's very real. I mean, and Nietzsche speaks about his awareness of this, of the lack of married philosophers, and how the married philosopher belongs in comedy. And he says, well, Socrates is married, but that was kind of his joke, right? He had Kant's joke that he explains, or that he justifies the common morality and metaphysics in terms that the common folk can't possibly understand. And we have Socrates' joke that the married philosopher only belongs in comedy, and of course, Socrates is a married philosopher. So is life a comedy to Socrates? Is that like his little wink and nod to all of us? And, I always go back to that Kierkegaard quote, marry and you will regret it. Do not marry and you will regret it. Marry or do not marry, you will regret it either way. And, we can imagine a counterfactual where Nietzsche was just a fundamentally different person, but ultimately the decisions he made placed him in solitude. And maybe you're wondering, like, is that something he really wanted? Well, based on how he evaluates solitude in his writings, it seems like it was. And even if he's, as I put it earlier, sleptwalked into that state of affairs in his life, then still that was in some sense a decision, right? Even if it's like an unconscious decision. It's like a realization of his character, of who he is. Nevertheless, on the other hand, we do know, it's like he may have proposed to Lou Salome. I'm halfway on that story. I'm agnostic about it. But we know for certain he proposed to some other women. And but at other times, or at least one occasion, there were women who showed interest in Nietzsche, and he wasn't really interested in them. So I guess I would say he did have the opportunity for perhaps more intimacy, or he did somewhat pursue that. We can see that drive in him. He's a human being. Most people have that drive. Ultimately, though, he did choose solitude. And I say that again with the nuance, the little asterisk by that claim, that he wasn't as solitary as he sometimes made out to be, that he had, no friends at all and was just a lonely man. Nietzsche had many friends and corresponded with him throughout his life. Often, they would come visit him at Sils Maria sometimes. And, he lived among people when he lived in Italy, especially during the wintertime. So, overall, yeah, he didn't really have a whole lot of those bonds of intimacy. He didn't really feel that kind of familial sense of duty or obligation to his father's calling or to his mother and sister. He did leave the university. He was enmeshed in a career in these relationships there. So all of these things do kind of point to a solitary person as just like in being in his nature, as just an inexorable thing with Nietzsche. But there was a little bit of that drive toward having more intimate relationships and friendships. He never obviously shared a life with someone, with a spouse or anything like that. But if he had really wanted that, he would have chased it down, I think. I think he realized, I think that was maybe, if the Lou Salome story is true, what's so sad about it for him is not like, Lou Salome is so special. It's just there's only so many women that he could have maybe imagined sharing a life with that were kind of on his level intellectually. For being all the sexist remarks he makes, Nietzsche seemed to very much like the company of intellectual women. And just very funny given some of the comments that he makes in his work that don't seem to reflect who he was as a person. So, yeah, I don't know. That's the best answer I can give. I guess it's a little bit rambly, but, he was who he was. I hope that statement is more than a tautology. Or I hope it comes across that way. Okay, next question from Archetypal Pickle. Have you thought of making a video on Nietzsche's influence on Aleister Crowley? No. I guess I'll give you more of an answer than that. Maybe that's an interesting idea. I've never really thought about it. I'm aware that there was some Nietzsche influence. But Crowley obviously is a metaphysical thinker, and I obviously don't mean that in a way similar to Schopenhauer or Kant. I mean that in a way similar to theosophy and magic and religion, right? And Crowley does begin a new religion. Now, it's not a religion for the masses. You could say that's perhaps a Nietzschean influence, but you can see that kind of influence with really anyone doing these esoteric orders revealing esoteric knowledge, these sort of steps, pathways, these degrees of initiation where you have to kind of prove yourself and advance in order to move up in the religion. That's a very different thing from Christianity, but it is still fundamentally religious. And Crowley, I used to be into all that kind of thing back when I was, more of an occultist in my youth. Never was really into Crowley, oddly enough. I think the thing about Crowley is there's so many stories about him that, to me, I'm not going to use the word charlatan necessarily, but point to someone who was perhaps like Osho, that kind of figure. Like, a guy who enjoys having power over the members of his club and having sex with them and, kind of finding his way into influence over parts of high society and things like that. And, I don't know. Maybe, again, this is another topic where if you have like a recommendation of something Crowley wrote that, has to do with Nietzsche, or if there's a text that talks about the influence of Nietzsche on his thought, maybe it could be an interesting topic. I mean, Crowley is probably less interesting to me philosophically than he is like historically for his influence on art and music and rock and roll. The references to Aleister Crowley abound in my genre, and his little manor out in the country, Boleskine. There's some very interesting historical connections. Famous musicians who died there, who went out and recorded albums there, all sorts of interesting and kind of weird connections with Crowley. And so that kind of interests me from a rock and roll history rather than philosophical history topic. So that doesn't mean I won't cover it. It just means I haven't really thought about it from the angle of Nietzsche's influence on Crowley because I don't know much about it. Okay, Bellaquarian asks, have you read Pierre Klosowski's book on Nietzsche? And if yes, would you like an episode about it? P.S. An episode about Bataille when? And I already responded to this question on Patreon. As I mentioned in a recent episode, I'm going to be talking about both Klosowski and Bataille very soon. So, hooray for you, Bellaquarian. You get exactly what you want. Okay, Alex Orion asks, once I had a colleague who openly described herself as a Catholic atheist, meaning she followed religious practices as a matter of tradition or cultural identity, but didn't believe in a personal God or an afterlife. When I later read about Epicurus, I noticed a similar attitude. He denied divine intervention and the afterlife, yet still encouraged his students to respect the religious customs of their city. Nietzsche, by contrast, saw this kind of participation as hypocritical. He argued that a true atheist shouldn't, for instance, baptize their child. Jung, on the other hand, seemed closer to Epicurus in recognizing the psychological value of religious ritual, even for non-believers. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. How would you compare these approaches? And if you're comfortable sharing, where do you personally stand on this question? Well, I mean, I've pretty much been an atheist my whole life, and I do mean atheist in the weak sense of the word, of lacking belief in God. I think in more properly in terms of what I know, I'm an agnostic, and I feel I get more agnostic every day. And I'm even agnostic toward, for example, the idea of the material world. And by that, I do not mean the world of the senses. I mean in the sense that where Nietzsche criticizes materialistic atomism as having found some bedrock of reality, some there's this idea of matter as this way of like having a noumenon, having a thing in itself, having, being, right? That all returns with materialistic atomism. So I'm even agnostic towards that, right? I'm agnostic towards any sort of claim about what the noumenal is. And in that way, I would consider myself both a Nietzschean, with my concern being the immediate world of the senses. And, in some ways post-Kantian about the Kant's critique of reason and the limits of reason, I think is still very much relevant in that way today. Regarding Epicurus, so first, I guess, my thoughts on how I would compare these approaches. I'm not sure Jung is really similar to Epicurus in this way. I mean, I see the similarity you're drawing out, but Jung, I think, treats religious claims a bit differently from Epicurus. I think for Epicurus, the issue is a hedonistic one, negative hedonism, right? In a word, utilitarianism, kind of in the modern sense, but more like a virtue ethics, consequential utilitarianism, if that makes any sense. How do you reduce the suffering in your life? It also happens to be the way that you're not going to cause a lot of suffering to other people, because one of the main forms of your suffering is going to be by the suffering you cause to others, causing blowback to come back to you, or the fear of reprisal, and so on and so forth. And that even applies to the gods. That, you don't want the gods to be wrathful and vindictive towards you if they do, in fact, exist. So for Epicurus, it's sort of like tabling the question of whether or not we could ever know that the gods exist, and then proceeding in a way that will cause the least suffering to yourself, all things considered. For Jung, he's also laid aside the question of like the scientific provability or falsifiability of these claims, but it's more out of this sort of maybe that agnosticism I was speaking about earlier. But for Jung, I think he would say that the psychological reality of these things, of gods and good and evil, and these archetypes and these narrative structures in our brain, is more real than any objective scientific fact. In some sense, Jung has more faith than I think even some Christians do in the power and the real reality of religious stories and the whole religious mode of thinking. And for Jung, that almost proves it eo ipso. And so Jung, I think, does have a kind of faith that Epicurus doesn't have. To put it in really cynical terms, for Epicurus, it's all a cover your ass routine. And for Jung, I really don't think it is. I think he also tables the question of whether or not we could objectively prove God. But for him, it's like again, and Jung would say there's a Nietzschean influence perhaps as well, right? Or that Nietzsche is of a kind with Jung on this, in thinking about this, that the value of these modes of thought, or the indispensability for us of these religious modes of thought, is such that it almost proves them, quote unquote. It just doesn't prove them in a scientific, objective way. So I'm not sure they're quite equivalent, if you know what I'm saying. They're different. I'm not going to say they're opposed in some fundamental way, but I think Jung might say that, Epicurus's concern purely with negative hedonism is something that might not be practicable for everyone, or even perhaps for no one, right? That in reality, the irrationality of religion is going to continue to burst through the seams into the consciousness from the unconscious, something like that. That this living, determining your religiosity from a purely rational standpoint, as Epicurus does, is not really the game that Jung is up to, and in some ways he does have faith. Now, I would say your Catholic atheist friend, I've spoken about this before, sometimes they call themselves cultural Catholics, just like there are cultural Jews. We don't really have that with Islam yet, but they'll get there one day. But we know these types of people, and I think to various degrees, it's probably less common for them to identify as atheists. I think a lot of these people are probably more deistic, or they're more just kind of, their spirituality is a little more open-ended, but they stick with the tradition because it's kind of grounding and there's a community there. And I understand all of that. The appeal there. I understand, as you say, a matter of tradition or cultural identity. Doesn't believe in personal God or an afterlife, but it's sort of a, but then that's yet a third kind of type, isn't it? And I'm not sure if there's a philosopher who, maybe Montaigne was like deep down someone like that he wouldn't have actually professed atheism. But it's just funny because if you really read Montaigne in his apology for Raymond Sebon, it's very clear that he is such an extreme agnostic who does not think you can rationally prove the faith at all, and that we do not know any of these things for certain. And yet at the end he says, well, I just follow the faith of my fathers, right? That's sort of where I was born. I'm not going to hold my own reason above the revelation because my reason has proven to be so fallible. So I'll just sort of accept this. That might be sort of another model with how to approach these things. So that would be my comparison on all of this. And yeah, as far as where do I stand on that? As I said, again, I've been an atheist most of my life. I'm pretty much agnostic. I have Catholic roots on either side of my family, but I wasn't raised Catholic. Neither of my parents were practicing. And so I had a very different experience with going to Catholic Mass than a lot of people whose families are Catholic and then become atheists. I was always an atheist, and because I didn't have to go to church all the time, whenever we would go for midnight mass, or the times when we did go, I actually rather enjoyed it, even as a child, because it was different. It wasn't I can imagine if that was, you had to go every Sunday, it might be, you might feel differently about it as a little kid, when you'd rather be running and playing outside and you gotta wear a suit and sit down and shut up and be quiet. And, the other thing is that Catholic churches are more ornate, or their architecture, they just have more of an eye for beauty. They actually care about that kind of thing. Whereas if you go to a Southern Baptist church, which is a lot of the people perhaps around me in Texas, there's Mexican American Catholics down here as well, but, a lot of Southern Baptists in rural Texas, and they have no eye for beauty. They don't care about that kind of thing. And I think it helped that it was we get to go to this cool building, and, the priest is speaking a different language, and there's all these rituals that were kind of interesting because I didn't see it all the time. I didn't see it every week. So I kind of have that, I guess I come from Catholic roots. I've come from Catholic people, but I've never really felt a connection to the church, other than the fact, I have good memories of going with my family. The more I've looked into Christianity, the more I do believe, I think the Orthodox Church, if I was Christian, I would think the Orthodox were probably the legitimate church. The Catholic Church are the first Protestants in a way, and that's a whole can of worms we don't need to get into. But I'm pretty detached from this question on a personal level. It's another phenomenon that interests me, and it speaks to something very important about religion and what it does, but it's not a very close question to my heart. It's just sort of an interesting social phenomenon. I think it's interesting philosophically as perhaps one of the stages of God's death, perhaps. Okay, Sean Hart asks, "Hey Keegan, thank you so much for all the work you put into the podcast. The depth, humility, and self-awareness you bring to philosophy is awe-inspiring. Thank you. Have you considered offering a live reading group or maybe some live short courses? I see others having success with this kind of thing, and I bet some folks on here would gladly pay to participate in something more active. And I'm planning to see you guys in Portland." Oh, thank you. Sean is coming to our show in Portland. That's cool. Well, it's not our show. It's like a little festival, mini festival. Sometimes the term festival is used a bit loosely, but it's like a 2-day event with a lot of really cool bands, a lot of touring acts as well. So that will be fun. So thank you, Sean. I have thought about this. I'm not sure logistically how I would do it, because would that be just the kind of thing I just offer for Patreon? And then I kind of have to consider what kind of course would I teach? In a way, you could say the Nietzsche Podcast is a course. How do other people do this? Do they, like a live reading group? I guess I could do something like that. I don't know. Like what we all read chapters and then we come in. And the thing is, I don't really like directing a discussion that way. I don't want to be the teacher where I'm telling people what's right and what's wrong about their interpretation. I kind of just prefer to give my own, which I feel is a pretty informed interpretation, but I don't really want to go in and be like, just when somebody's just trying to understand the text and be guiding them. I guess that's already what I'm doing with the podcast, but there's something about it in person that, I don't know. I'm just not that personality type of wanting to be the authority figure in a discussion setting, if that makes sense. I wouldn't mind doing a course in terms of, I have thought about it going a course that just teaches you how to read Nietzsche in a way, okay, we're going to start with these books and here are some maybe essay questions to suggest to people that you could write on. Here are some supplementary material. Kind of lay out a path of how to, if I were to structure Nietzsche 101, everything you need to know about Nietzsche, in the form of 2 semesters worth of course material, how would I do that? I've thought about that. It's kind of an interesting notion. But I don't know. I guess logistically, I haven't really thought about it. There's a lot of possibilities, as you point out. And would this be something for Patreon or a certain tier of patrons or something like that? You get into these courses, but then could I also sell them separately? I guess I could. I don't know. My big project right now is finishing my book, and I think to give you information that you didn't ask about at all, but might be kind of interesting about one of the next big projects I'm working on, is I think I'm going to go with self-publishing just through Amazon, and then self-publish the audiobook, record that myself. I've worked it out. It's probably going to be 18 hours would be what the audiobook would be. And then just sell that, right? I think there would be a huge demand for the audiobook, and not have it available anywhere. I'd probably give the patrons a discount or something like that. Probably a significant one, but just make it to where you have to buy it in order to get the audiobook, right? And I think that could be a big deal, but that's going to be a big project for me to record. I've thought about actually going out to a recording studio to do that, to just book some time and have somebody else to kind of punch me in and out, so I'm not doing all the work, not doing all the editing, so I could crank out a product that way. But I'm not exactly sure. So, after I'm done with all that, I might think about doing some kind of project like this. But I don't know. I'll have to think about it. Let's go to the next question. Michael H. He asks, I'm wondering about the connection between metal music and Nietzsche. It seems that liking one is a good predictor of liking the other. Of course, there are shared themes of power, myth, and legend standing apart from the crowd. Would Nietzsche have enjoyed metal if he were alive today? Or would it be like Wagner's music for him, where he initially identified with it, but then became critical? Is metal too stuck in the past, set on recreating what has already been done? Wouldn't that conflict with Nietzsche's vision of creating new values? I'm reminded here of your treatise on doom metal, and the idea that doom metal reflects the eternal and unchanging nature of tragedy. It rejects notions of progress and instead embraces endless repetition. Would you say that that is your viewpoint now? Doesn't repetition risk becoming conservative and backwards looking, losing its grip on an ever-changing flux, / becoming of reality and culture? Deleuze might have had something to say about this and difference and repetition, but I have not read it. I would think that, sorry, I was just laughing because it reminded me of like a meme, like Nietzsche speaks of this. Have you read him? No. Right. So Deleuze speaks of this. I would think, though, that creating new values has both difference and repetition. That also means taking bold creative risks, defying audience expectations and genre conventions, which arguably metal isn't doing a lot of recently, aside from Sleep Token maybe, and of course Slumbering Sun. Oh, thank you. Would love to hear your thoughts. It's funny, I just listened to Sleep Token for the first time the other day, and I listened to their newer album, and I was like, it's not even metal. It's like, it's like rap. And I guess it incorporates some metal parts, but it's like, so I had to go back and listen to their earlier material, and I was like, oh, like, wow, they've done like they always had these elements, but they did almost a complete genre change. Like they're pulling a Radiohead on everybody. I didn't really care for it that much, I have to say. I mean, he's a good singer, but it wasn't really my thing. But yeah, they are definitely defying audience expectations. I'll give them that for sure. And I mean, thank you for saying that my band, of course, is not playing to genre expectations either. And you brought up the doom metal treatise, which I bear some explanation because eventually this will get a general public release, and none of them have heard that. That's something I published on Patreon for the patrons. It's like 50 pages of me with articulating an aesthetic philosophy of doom metal. I was kind of inspired by Hela Hunt Hendricks, as well as from Liturgy, as well as Earl of Void from Reverend Bazaar, and I reference both of them in the treatise. It was something I'd always wanted to do, but I came across like their works, Hela Hunt Hendricks did a black metal treatise and or transcendental black metal treatise, and Earl of Void did a doom metal treatise of his own. His is more kind of historical, chronological, explaining what the genre is and what there's a little bit of the philosophy, articulating the philosophy of it. And he says some very interesting and nuanced things that I quoted from. But yeah, I mean, how Michael describes it here is mostly correct, that I think doom metal is like, it's the working man's form of tragedy, which is sort of a contradiction in terms. And it goes back to, like, what I was trying to get at is that the doom metal comes from the blues, and blues always centers personal struggles that are the same familiar struggles, that the struggles repeat again and again. I mean, you might think of Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations, where he talks about how culture is made up of these questions that are the impersonal questions of life. So there are all the personal questions of life, things that are proper to you personally and your personality, your circumstances, your background, etc. And then there are the questions like coming of age, death, marriage, having a child, the loss of loved ones, how to discover your calling in life. These sort of the things that everyone has to confront. And I was sort of looking at it like, what is the appeal of going back to the blues? Because that's always been the main, like the heart and soul of doom metal. And I also, having read Hela Hunt Hendricks's treatise on black metal, which kind of portrays the whole metal project as like this perpetual striving after greater and greater intensity, like reaching a haptic void, right? So haptics, sort of like sound stimulation, this state of that's like so overstimulated and spastic that it almost becomes like a void, in the sense of, you could imagine like just static, popcorn static on an old television, right? That's not tuned to any station. There's a lot of activity and chaos, right? But there's so much activity and chaos that it's like nothing. You're not looking at anything. There's no image. There's nothing concrete there. And so the whole argument in that treatise is basically that metal's been pushing towards that, constantly trying to reach this state of absolute stimulation, just spastic energy, something like that. And that's why we have speed metal, thrash metal, and death metal, and black metal, and they get more and more extreme until it's just a blast beat, just constant bombardment. And it struck me that it was very interesting that doom metal was not mentioned at all in that treatise, and it made me think, well, that's because doom metal, it's funny because it's the oldest form of metal. It seems to be forgotten about among the sort of mainstream milieu of metalheads. But it just struck me that this didn't describe what doom metal was doing at all. It seemed like this was a genre that came directly out of the blues, and that later metal, like what most people think of as metal, which really comes into being, I think, with like in the 1980s with thrash metal, that gets an infusion from not only all the rock and roll that's been played, that, is a genre unto itself, that, many of those tropes of rock and roll flow directly into the 80s kind of heavy metal main line of metal. And then also punk rock was a huge deal that completely changed all of like what metal was doing, and introduced speed as like a consideration of getting faster and faster and faster, right? Punk and even hardcore punk and grindcore and all of these genres have been in dialogue with metal this whole time. And it just struck me like doom metal isn't doing that. It's like instead we're just kind of going back to the same source over and over and over again. And that doesn't mean there's not development in the ideas, that there aren't changes in the way that the bands do things, or some of the, I don't want to just say tropes, but the techniques they use, the different aspects of the genre. It's not like they don't get modified or they're not changing according to the different artistic tastes or just the creativity of who's making the music. But it seemed like that rather than trying to get more and more intense, doom metal was always going back to those impersonal questions, the impersonal tragedies, the eternal tragedies, the ones that everyone has to deal with from time to time in their life. Loss of a loved one, the loss of a romance or of a relationship, the existential struggles with who am I in the world, what's my place in the world, and struggles with mental health and anxiety and depression and addiction and alcoholism. This was all spoken about in the blues, and doom metal always seemed to be like a little bit more personal, more emotive, always kind of like going back to that same well. That was more, it's about writing about what's real and what actually affects people's lives. Whereas the rest of metal kind of went off into, Manowar territory of ripped guys with big swords and, dragons and, Cannibal Corpse, like torture porn, and, in prog metal, you get like sci-fi imagery. It's all very much like fantasy and fantastical. And that's all fine. I'm not knocking that. I'm just saying it's a really different thing. And people will look at doom metal now and say, well, doom metal has all of that. And it's like, yeah, but again, that was an infusion from another genre. Like in the 90s, stoner metal kind of comes in, and suddenly we get all this kind of astral plane imagery and mushrooms and psychedelics and, sleeps, Dragonaut, that kind of thing, right? Like we're going on a trip and we're riding a dragon, that kind of, which is another form of escapism. And so that's become a part of the genre too. And I'm not trying to knock that either. But I felt that the emotional core of the genre, again, was talking about what's real, talking about... And so is that conservative? Is that failing to create new values? I mean, you could say as long as people are human beings and they have these same struggles. And again, that's what's so... I guess you could say that is a conservative, quote-unquote, aspect of it, is that there's something that's going to be a little bit more universalist when it's a working man's genre. There's going to be something that's like a little bit more concerned with, not necessarily opening up new vistas of imagination so much as like confronting the reality that's right in front of our face, something like that. And I think, in the same way that a novel from the 1700s can speak to existential concerns that might be shared by someone today, there's still plenty of room for innovation there and creativity. It's not that I'm saying the whole point of the genre is the endless repetition. That wasn't my point there. And I've looked at the doom metal treatise recently, and there's a lot of room for self-criticism there, which I maybe won't get so much into. I'll just say that, I think that ultimately I may have given a little too much focus to this idea of like the eternality of the genre. I recently said it when I was doing my episode about the new release for Slumbering Sun, was talking about how, when genres become popular, when all of the tropes of the genre become reified and they become codified in some sense, that's when things start to become stale. And that nobody who was creating the genre really they didn't have the desire to confine themselves in that way, to circumscribe what they're doing according to a set of rules, right? They didn't even have the awareness that they were making rules. They were just being creative. Like almost everyone who creates a new genre or new innovation in music, they weren't thinking in those terms. And so maybe something I didn't sufficiently emphasize in that treatise, and it is another thing I brought up in that recent podcast episode, is just the idea that by going back to the source, you do open up more of a chance for creativity, because it's not attempting to go back to just repeating what someone else has done. You're like looking at like the spiritual or emotional core of what they're doing for inspiration, which all art is based on. And don't let anyone lie to you. Don't let any artist lie to you and say that their inspiration just comes solely from within them. They are standing on the shoulders of giants, as we say. We all are doing it. A lot of musicians are very shy about their influences. I am not. I love talking about influences. Like, just be honest. We learn from people who played in the past, and we all start out trying to emulate what other people did. And it's in that emulation that you eventually learn the language of the music or the language of your art form, and then you can improvise and be creative after having learned all of that, right? Anyway, that's all a sidetrack. I guess what I'm saying is going back to the spirit rather than the letter of the genre, of the original spirit. And the original spirit was not based on like the rules of the genre, right? You're trying to convey something, and then they make a certain artistic product that conveys it, and then people try to like emulate that. That's very useful to emulate that from the standpoint, again, of building your artistic repertoire, or whatever it may be. But when the genre just becomes imitation, that's when it sucks, and that's when they say the genre's dead, right? And so in any case, I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think that's needs to be creatively stifling to like eternally return to the source of the genre, if you will. In the same way, it's like, what are jazz musicians just, they need to grow up and make their own new form of music. It's like, no, there's still new and interesting and creative things being done in that genre, right? It's probably not by people who have like a rigid idea of what the genre is or has to be. I mean, but there's still people who've been saying rock music or guitar music is dead for fucking 40 years now. And there's still amazing things going on in new guitar music that, wouldn't have been written even 10 or 20 years ago. And so, I don't know. I think a lot of people don't have these attitudes about old forms of art or old forms of artistic expression when it comes to like classical music or Baroque music or classical schools of painting or sculpture, right? Like art forms from hundreds of years ago, those aren't dead, but they'll say music from 40 years ago is dead. It's like, it doesn't really make any sense. If it's good, it's good. If it moves you, it moves you. That's really the thing. You have something in you that you're trying to express. You're trying to get it out to the world. And certain things resonate with you, and you want what's in you to resonate with others. And that's what it's all really about. And so going back to that source, that's a way of kind of like grounding what you're doing. And it's good to actually set some limitations on yourself. We set limitations on ourselves in Slumbering Sun. Not so much in genre, but like the band I was in with James, the vocalist, before that, he was doing a lot of like screaming, like guttural shrieks. And that a lot of people really liked that band, and I still really liked what we did in that band. But we decided from the beginning a limitation we're going to put on ourselves is not to do that in this band, because it could easily become like a crutch. Every time you need to get intense, every time you have to make a point, that's where it gets, that's where the shriek comes in. And it's like, no, you have to make that intensity come through with melody and melody alone, right? That's an interesting artistic limitation to put on yourself. And so I'm a big fan of that. So going back to the origins of the genre and being like, I want to write a traditional doom metal album in a way that can free you from, is it more limiting to do that, to go back to the source and try and recapture the spirit of what they were trying to do at the beginning and pick up on a lot of the techniques as part of a musical lexicon and then do something new with it? I mean, is that more limiting? Is that more conservative? Or is it more limiting to have to reconsider the music you're making in relation to everything that's been made in the last 50 years, right? Like there's basically, doom metal's been around for 55 years now, technically. So in a way, going back to the traditional roots frees you from 55 years of what people have been doing, right? You could say, well, what, are you ignoring the progress in the genre for 55 years? Well, I don't believe in artistic progress in that way, right? And that's why maybe I don't think this is the same kind of question as creating new values or however you want to put it. I don't believe in progress in the sense that, yeah, we do determine new artistic technologies and techniques, but again, something can move you just as much 500 years ago as a piece of art that's made now, and it's just different. It's not necessarily better or worse. I don't know. Like just from as a result of having come later. I don't believe in that. And there is a sense in which people do get confined. They get limited by saying, well, I want to do a fresh take on this. I want to take, this genre and combine it with another genre. And someone says, well, somebody else already did that 15 years ago. You can get caught up comparing yourself to like, is this really hot? Is this really fresh? Is this really like the newest thing, or has somebody already done it? There's something that's actually freeing about saying, who cares if somebody's already done it? It's in the same way I was talking about before, when you just sort of nakedly wear your influence on your sleeve, it actually allows what is you, what's definitively you, to shine through very clearly, because you see it, again, like in Metallica's first record that, as I've said, could be in some sense just a Motorhead cover album, but it's very clearly not, right? His vocals are very different from Lemmy's vocals, for instance. Like that's the first thing that stands out, right? And then that gets developed over the years. And so, I don't know, I guess I'm kind of going in a circle here, but I guess your question is, you're wondering about the connection between metal music and Nietzsche. Liking one is a good predictor of liking the other. Well, I think, yeah, there are those similarities that you bring up. I think it's also that Nietzsche just happens to be one of the most popular philosophers, and he's atheistic, and he is a prophet of modernity, and he speaks to the human condition in modernity, the sort of the postmodern condition, the existentialist condition, the psychological condition of the modern man. And so Nietzsche, I think, appeals to many metalheads for that reason. He's an out-of-the-box thinker. He go against the herd, as you say, the collective, or stand apart from the crowd, however you want to put it. And yeah, that definitely, there's an appeal there. I personally don't think that metal is all that rebellious in reality. It's actually very, metalheads are mostly fairly normal people. This is the funny thing. They're not even really like punks. And even punks are not that rebellious in actual practical terms. But metalheads don't even really have the pretense of being that rebellious these days. I mean, it's a pretty normal thing to be. And, you could also say, well, the fact that Nietzsche is the most popular philosopher, even though he's so elitist and anti-universalist, it's sort of like the same thing. There's sort of like this veneer of being a rebel or standing apart from the crowd when in reality you're not. Sorry to burst everyone's bubble about Nietzsche and heavy metal, but, it's important to be honest and sober with ourselves. So, yeah, I think there is definitely a connection there. And does it have to do with the themes? Does it have to do with just like Nietzsche appeals to the same personality type that will generally like heavy metal. I don't know. I think, I will say this, metal is a very intellectual genre, and that's the other sort of like contradiction about it, that many people, looking from the outside in, they'll regard metal as it must be a very emotional, a very passionate genre. It must be about aggression and testosterone and these things. That's all certainly there, but it's very intellectual and introspective, and there's so much erudition in metal, both in terms of the study of musical theory and also, like you can listen to even an Iron Maiden album, which is not considered highbrow music. It's not even really highbrow by metal standards, but sometimes Bruce Dickinson will be giving like practically a fucking speech about Alexander the Great, breathlessly rattling off facts about his life to the very end of the song. So it's like, there is that aspect of metal that I think also appeals to like people who read philosophy. Would Nietzsche have enjoyed metal if he were alive today? That's one of those questions I really can't answer. Is it like Wagner's music? In many ways, Wagner did influence heavy metal. There are very important similarities. Would he have rejected it later? I don't really know. That's the thing. Nietzsche doesn't really reject Wagner's music later. Nietzsche always likes Wagner's music. What he doesn't like is the cultural movement behind Wagner. He doesn't like the Wagnerians, the people who are part of that movement. He doesn't like what happened to Wagner as a person. And he does, criticize Wagner for being, the shorthand is emotionally manipulative, right? Just playing on the heartstrings in some way, being like a magician or an actor. But in terms of just like composition, like Wagner's merit, his chops as a composer, I don't think Nietzsche I don't think he really turns against Wagner in that way. I think he would have still held Wagner up to be the greatest composer of his era. But that's why Wagner's such a great example of what happens to the great man. Think about that, how often Nietzsche brings up the example of the great man, the great artist, the great musician, whoever it might be, who doesn't turn out well, who is botched in some way, that there are 1,000 different ways that he can be botched, right? And in Wagner's case, it's audience capture. It could be one way of looking at it. That's one way that a great man can be botched. And Wagner provides an excellent example of that. But that doesn't mean he's not a great composer. That's something I've come to understand about Nietzsche's relationship to Wagner, that I do feel it's often misrepresented, where it's like, oh, he turned against Wagner's music. It's because he has those lines, and later collected in Case of Wagner, but I think it's in the third essay of the genealogy, where he's talking about how Bizet is so much better than Wagner and for his taste, and just tearing into Parsifal. But even then, what Nietzsche said privately about Parsifal is not really, it shows that his feelings were a bit more complicated on it, that, you can't, in some sense, it's sort of like, you can't deny the genius in the music, right? There have been all sorts of people who are very flawed human beings who make great music and continue to make great music. Like, I guess he's not a good example because he's dead now, but there are all sorts of like megalomaniacal and just weird things about Prince, for example. And people have talked about meeting him and just talked about like what a jerk he is. And manifestly, he's a weirdo because he's a Jehovah's Witness, and he, I think, died of AIDS because he probably partied too hard and probably, engaged in all sorts of debauchery. But you watch Prince play guitar, and you can't deny the genius. You can't be like, he's a bad guitar player. Like, he's a bad composer because of that. No, and I'm not saying separate the art from the artist. I think that's also something you fundamentally can't do. People repeat that phrase sort of like art for art's sake, and it doesn't really actually make sense. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, like, you can't deny the talent or the genius because of like what kind of person they are, right? And I think that is really descriptive of Nietzsche's dispute with Wagner. So I don't know how Nietzsche would feel about metal. I think, as an objective comment on Wagner's music, it does influence heavy metal. And you could see Wagner as a precursor to heavy metal. You definitely. Would Nietzsche like it? I mean, his ears were probably not attuned to that kind of thing. He probably wouldn't understand it. Just like, if you played somebody today music from 150 years in the future from now, they probably wouldn't understand it or have any context for it. So, I don't really know. I'm always very uncomfortable making determinations like that. But I guess that's my answer. I've talked for a while about doom metal and Nietzsche and metalheads and all that. So, yeah, that's my answer on all of that. Thanks, Michael. All right, we have one final question from Graham Berger, who asks, how would you describe Nietzsche's relationship with justice? Is it as simple as the Thucydidean and Machiavellian view that the powerful decide what is and isn't just? Furthermore, how would Nietzsche compare the modern conception of justice with the base instinct for revenge? Well, I think Nietzsche would say that there's a very intense relationship between justice and revenge. I would recommend, if you haven't listened to the episode on the Oresteia, that would be a really great episode. It doesn't really speak to Nietzsche's views, but it does. I mean, I talk about it obviously a little bit because it's the Nietzsche podcast, but this relationship between justice and vengeance, like this idea of justice as settling the scales, that justice is something that happens retroactively or post hoc, that you need an injustice. It's like a disturbance when somebody acts beyond their right. Right and justice are somewhat, they're different translations of the same word, dike or dikain in ancient Greek. I forget which one, it's not important. What's important is the idea that an injustice was when somebody acts beyond their right, when they do something that might be considered a slight, something that they didn't have the right to do, something which somehow trammels on the rights or privileges or dignity of some other party, who then has to revenge themselves or requite themselves upon the other party. And really, the modern conception of justice is what we get at the end of the Oresteia, where we have the civic conception of justice, that we can't just have score settling from these parties. I mean, then again, to bring in Grunbeck's work on the Teutons, the culture of the Teutons, that to the ancient Germans, their honor wasn't something that they could just do without. If you did something to slight their honor, they had to revenge themselves. And that was, that's like a stage in human psychological development where justice and revenge are pretty much the same thing in some sense. Like if somebody does harm to you or one of your clan, one of your family that you're responsible for, whoever the responsible party is, you need to take revenge. You are the police in this, you're the judge, jury, and the executioner. And you're recompensing them, you're recompensing your own honor. You're showing that you are honorable, because what it means to be honorable is to be able to requite harm with harm, right? That's the whole original meaning. Then we get this civic conception of justice that's represented in the Oresteia by Athena, who says, the parties, this back and forth of reciprocal violence for past slights can go on forever. We're going to settle this. We're going to have a jury trial. The important thing is that Athena basically says, we're going to establish the state as the arbiter of justice. We're taking it out of the hands of the individual, and we are going to, their fellow citizens will decide what should be done in a given case. That would have been unacceptable to a Teutonic German. We might say that's like a later stage of civilization, right? And what does Nietzsche say? He says, justice is the word that the tarantulas use, right? So these preachers of equality, of the, this idealism that makes everyone the same, that equalizes unequal things, and they want justice, and they're speaking of justice, and these very sort of high-minded idealistic terms, but Nietzsche says what lies behind your word justice is actually revenge. And what you could argue is that revenge element has always been there from the very beginning, in the sense that when we get the civic conception of justice, that's the state taking on the monopoly on violence. The state is the thing that revenges. You're impinging the honor of the state, really, when you commit a crime, when you violate one of its rules, when you violate the law. You set yourself above the law that the state is supposed to be above you, right? And so the state revenges itself on you. And so then now we have these ideas of economic justice or social justice. Is revenge beneath that too? Well, Nietzsche would say, yes, it is. That's driven by ressentiment, these calls to equalize everything. That's driven by the hatred of the dispossessed, of those who have been the losers of this system, whether it be a capitalist meritocracy or some sort of aristocratic hierarchy or whatever. Those who are on the lower rungs are going to have an unfulfilled desire for revenge against those above them. And then that's represented by these cries, modern conceptions of justice, we might say. But that's the thing. People will often quote the Tarantulas passage as if Nietzsche was specifically calling out the SJWs, but the important thing, I think, is the through line that justice has always been about revenge, in the sense that it's always been about requital, and that even establishing the social contract, right, the Thucydidean conception that you bring up, that we see in the Melian dialogue. What's revealed in the Melian dialogue is that when there are two parties of unequal strength, there is no justice. Justice is a concern that it's a relative concern of parties of relatively equal strength, of not wanting to go beyond their right in respect to one another because it could be injurious to both of them to engage in a conflict. So you have to have come to some sort of agreement, some sort of contract, and have these rules obtain over both of you, both parties, so the two warring states or two warring kings, whatever the case may be. That even like all of these concepts of rights and sovereignties, at the foundation of them is requital, this whole interaction of reciprocal violence that can erupt. That's sort of like the threat, right? That there's this state of nature that can erupt if these things aren't honored. And so I've often said that, it's not correct to say that Nietzsche says might makes right. I would say that Nietzsche doesn't have a concept of right in the way he would say might makes might. That's all it is. If you're mighty, you're mighty. The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Now, as far as the Machiavellian view, it's not clear to me that is Machiavelli's view. I mean, Machiavelli thinks that it's better if the people have more liberty, and that the Republican system of government is better than a princedom, where there are inputs into the system from the oligarchy, from the king, and from the common folk. And he would say that this creates the most sort of enduring system of government, that you can create the greatest conditions for the most liberty for a people for the longest time within the Republican system. So I think Machiavelli is often sort of unfairly tied in with, he does influence Nietzsche greatly. He influences him from the angle of political science, and that's also what unites Machiavelli and Thucydides, is that they think about politics amorally. But Machiavelli, I think, is often unfairly considered to be like amoral himself. He's amoral in the sense that like science is amoral. Like your moral considerations don't affect the boiling point of water, just like your moral considerations don't affect how effective it's going to be or how ineffective it's going to be to hire mercenaries to be your army, right? Machiavelli's just pointing out a fact. It's not, mercenaries aren't reliable, That doesn't mean he has no moral goals or aims himself, just as the scientist who tells you the boiling point of water might have all sorts of moral goals and aims. So that's sort of the thing about Machiavellianism. It is amoral in that sense. It's in a scientific sense, it's amoral. Nietzsche, I think, is amoral in a moral sense. That's a bit redundant, but Nietzsche has this immoralist conception of justice that, like as he says at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, could it not be possible that all of the highest things in humanity, our highest values hitherto, could in fact be derivations of, or rarefactions, of baser, vicious impulses? Could everything that's virtuous and valuable about mankind, everything that we hold the highest, actually be transmutations of what is the lowest? And I think justice is a perfect example. That would be Nietzsche's relationship to justice. It's a sort of similar relationship that he has to the virtues of selflessness or to charity or pity, that he uncovers that there is something beneath it that refers us back to will to power, which is fundamentally an amoralistic interpretation of the world that I think in that way, goes farther than Machiavelli. It goes farther than Thucydides. Because Thucydides, we've already discussed Machiavelli. He has his own ends. He wants Italian independence. He wants Italian sovereignty. He believes in liberty. He believes liberty should be expanded as long as possible. Thucydides is an Athenian. He doesn't, again, like Machiavelli, he does not let that color the political science of his work. That's what's so admirable about him. But it's very interesting what Nietzsche says about Thucydidean, about his view of justice. And Nietzsche says that Thucydides has a sense for practical justice, meaning he lets everyone sort of speak for themselves. He analyzes the values, the drives, the competing interests, the competing, what gives it, advantage to either side, their competing perspective, essentially, and allows these perspectives to sort of articulate themselves and describes how their struggle plays out without trying to arbitrate the struggle as a sort of moralist. Another thing Nietzsche says is that he sees reason in reality rather than in reason. So not this theoretical Platonist approach of, there's always this idea, if you call someone a hypocrite, you're presupposing that there's a judge above both of you to whom such an appeal to the hypocrisy of your opponent actually matters. But in reality, it doesn't matter to call your opponent a hypocrite, because who is going to hold them to account on that? No one, right? You don't have the power to hold them to account. And similarly, you could say Thucydides could make all sorts of editorialized comments about how the Spartans acted so unjustly or so unfairly. But, was there a judge above the Spartans and Athenians to arbitrate that dispute? Well, it kind of, the theoretical perspective, places yourself in that role. But you don't actually have the power to be the arbiter, right? In reality, the conflict is arbitrated by force of the two parties. And so Nietzsche's relationship to justice, to cite another Greek, we could look at Heraclitus. Strife is justice, right? War is the father of all and the king of all. Some he makes slaves and some free, or some war reveals to be slaves and others to be free men. And so the war between Athens and Sparta revealed that Sparta was the rightful ruler of the Greek civilization. Why were they the rightful ruler? Because they won the war, right? And you can have all your moral or theoretical counterpoints, but that, in some sense, I mean this in the purest sense, actually, that's all academic. It doesn't actually matter, right? And so justice is found in strife. Justice is a product of conflict. Justice is what is determined to be right. Maybe this will come off very cynical, but there's that Norm Macdonald quote where he's like, I was reading this history book and it turns out that the good guys won every time. What are the odds? There you have it, right? Who was right in the conflict? That's always a retrospective determination usually by somebody who has their own moral stake in the conflict. And those judgments are really, they don't bear any material reality to who wins or loses the conflict, who actually imposes their perspective on the world, imposes with force their valuations on the world. You could say that's like a natural way of looking at justice, that no matter what, the justest outcome is always determined by the natural strife of will to power at every moment. And that's a way of sort of, again, radically making the world innocent. Everything that happens in the world is just because strife is justice. That's, so it all comes back to fate yet again. But that would be my answer. And I would say the Oresteia is a really important episode for talking about this, as would be the episode on Thucydides and Machiavelli that you bring up both of them. I assume you've seen those. So I guess that would be my answer. So thank you, everybody. That is the last question for today. I had a lot of fun with these. This was probably one of my favorite Q&As so far, actually. Not too many questions that, sometimes you get some that are like out of left field or you just have no idea what to say about them. I feel like I had quite a bit to say about a lot of these. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for submitting your questions. I think this was a good session. All right. Very exciting time. Thanks for tuning in. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche Podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.